Imagine being dragged 500 meters into the pitch-black abyss by a monstrous, roaring Leviathan.
Yeah, just absolute nightmare fuel.
Right. The water pressure is crushing. You have, 4 minutes of oxygen remaining. There's no rescue coming.
None at all.
So, do you freeze in absolute paralyzing terror? Or do you reach for a jagged piece of metal and decide that if you're going down, you're taking the apex predator of this planet with you?
I mean, I know what I'd want to do, but realistically...
Right. Realistically, most of us freeze. But today, we are looking at that latter response. We are bypassing the typical journey of the terrified survivor.
Yeah, we're diving into the psychological profile of the legendary Marguerit Maida.
Exactly. The mercenary who crashed on planet 4546b and basically went straight to war. We want you, the listener, to just, pull up a chair as we unpack a really fascinating mystery today.
It really is.
Why do some human minds shatter when faced with the absolute unknown, while others transform into something far more dangerous than the monsters hunting them?
And to get to the bottom of that, we really have to synthesize a massive amount of cross-disciplinary data today.
Oh yeah, we've got a lot to cover.
We'll be analyzing the in-game lore surrounding the catastrophic failure of the Degassi crew, dissecting the deep-sea survival mechanics that make 4546b so uniquely punishing, and grounding all of this in complex psychological and neurological research.
Right, we'll be looking closely at Amanda Ripley's investigations into normalcy bias.
Exactly, and the mid-century clinical studies on ambiguity tolerance, plus the profound neurological rewiring that occurs during post-traumatic growth.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can even begin to dissect Margaret's mind, we really need to understand the crucible she was dropped into.
Yeah, the environment itself is a huge factor.
Right. Keep in mind, her crash happens 10 years prior to the events most people are familiar with. There's no established baseline. There are no distress beacons from other life pods.
They're just completely alone.
Exactly. And the environmental psychology of 4546b is practically engineered in a laboratory to systematically dismantle human cognition.
Yeah.
You have the collision of thalassophobia, which is the intense fear of deep bodies of water, and kenophobia, the fear of vast, empty, open spaces.
Which is a terrifying combination.
But it goes beyond just, being afraid of the dark.
It does. I mean, the human brain has evolved over millions of years to navigate terrestrial environments using very specific spatial mapping tools.
Like what, exactly?
Well, in the hippocampus, we have what are known as grid cells and place cells. They constantly triangulate our position based on fixed environmental anchors.
So like the horizon line.
Right. The horizon, a distant mountain range, the canopy of trees above us. But when a human being plunges into the deep oceanic trenches of 4546b, particularly biomes like the sparse reef or the edge of the crater, those environmental anchors are entirely stripped away.
Just gone.
Yeah. The grid cells in the hippocampus lose their reference points entirely. You are suspended in a three-dimensional omnidirectional void where threats can materialize from above, below, or behind you.
Oh, wow.
So the brain's spatial mapping system essentially crashes. It floods the nervous system with a constant low-grade cortisol release because it literally cannot confidently locate the body in space.
Wow. So you're already in a state of baseline physiological panic just by being suspended in the water.
Exactly. Even before anything attacks you.
And then there's the mechanical reality of the situation.
Yeah.
The sources explicitly detail how survival in this space forces a very unnatural pacifist run-and-hide loop.
Yeah, you are intentionally denied practical offensive weapons.
Right. I mean, a combat knife is laughable against a creature the size of a submarine, and the torpedoes you can craft later act as, minor deterrents at best.
Yeah, they just annoy them mostly.
So you are entirely stripped of the human evolutionary instinct to dominate and control an environment through tool use.
Which totally accelerates the psychological erosion. When you take away a human's ability to exert physical agency over a threat, you force them into a chronic state of passive endurance.
And just waiting to be attacked.
Right. And that endurance is tested by the environment actively degrading cognitive function. Let's look at the mechanics of pressure and depth. Deep sea submersible data and physiological playtests reveal a phenomenon akin to retinal compression.
Retinal compression.
Yeah, so as you descend, the sheer atmospheric pressure alters the ocular fluid in the eye. And the extreme absence of ambient light forces the pupils to dilate to their maximum capacity while the brain struggles to process the lack of contrast.
Okay.
This effectively reduces your peripheral vision significantly for every couple of 100 meters you descend. Your visual field literally shrinks into a tunnel.
Oh man, I can't even imagine the claustrophobia that you have an infinite open ocean, but your brain is trapped inside this tiny shrinking cone of vision.
It's awful, and that visual narrowing is compounded by mechanical latency.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when piloting a deep-sea vehicle like a prawn suit or a cyclops at extreme depths, the sources note a slight delay in feedback loops, sometimes just 0.4 seconds of lag between a manual input and the mechanical response.
Oh, that drives me crazy.
Neurologically, it's devastating. The brain relies on proprioception, the sense of self-movement matching perfectly with visual and tactile feedback.
Right, like when you move your hand, you expect to see it move instantly.
Exactly. So when you introduce a micro delay, the parietal lobe registers a mismatch. It creates narrative dissonance. Over hours of navigation, this micro-frustration compounds into immense cognitive fatigue.
The brain just gets tired of compensating.
Right. The brain stops trusting its own sensory inputs. This is why individuals in prolonged, isolated deep-sea environments begin to experience hallucinations.
Wow.
The brain is starved of reliable input, so it becomes an inference machine running in overdrive. It starts manufacturing sensory data to fill the void.
That totally explains the auditory hallucinations mentioned in the logs. People hearing whispers in the water or seeing massive shadows moving in the corner of their narrowed vision when nothing is actually there.
Because the brain is so desperate for a pattern, it just makes one up.
Yeah, and the auditory cortex is particularly vulnerable to this, right?
Oh, absolutely. In an environment devoid of normal terrestrial background noise, no wind through leaves, no human chatter, no ambient city hum, the auditory cortex turns up its internal synaptic gain.
It becomes hypersensitive.
Yes, but the only sounds it receives are alien, distorted, and threatening.
Which brings us to the echolocation mechanic of the Reaper Leviathan.
Oh, this is terrifying.
If you hear that distant, terrifying roar echoing to the water, it's not a territorial warning. It means the Reaper has already sent out a biological sonar ping, and that ping has bounced off your body and returned to the predator.
Right.
You can hear the roar, it already knows exactly where you are.
What's fascinating here is the sheer elegance of how this mechanism weaponizes human psychology against itself.
How so?
It preys on the most fundamental fear we possess, the anticipation of an invisible threat. Because the ambient environment is so silent, the brain hyperfixates on whatever stimuli it can detect.
Oh, God.
So the survivor is trapped listening to the deafening, rhythmic sound of their own distorted breathing through an oxygen regulator, contrasted against the distant, deliberate roars of a predator that has already locked onto them.
That's horrifying.
It bypasses the rational prefrontal cortex entirely and triggers the amygdala's freeze response.
It's like being locked inside a pitch-black, haunted house. The doors have locked behind you, you have no flashlight, and the only thing you can do is stand perfectly still and listen to the monster breathing in the dark, knowing that it can see you perfectly.
It's the ultimate nightmare.
Ask yourself,
Yeah.
if you were treading water in the dark right now and you heard that roar, would your instinct be to freeze and pray it passes, or would you swim toward it?
Most people would freeze.
Yeah, and your answer to that question dictates whether you are going to survive the first week on 4546b. So if this planet is a machine perfectly calibrated to induce absolute panic, how does a human being process it without their mind fracturing?
To answer that, we have to examine the Degassi divide. We have 3 survivors who experienced the exact same traumatic event, the crash of their ship, but their psychological responses diverged completely.
Right, Paul, Bart, and Margaret.
Exactly. And we're focusing on Paul Torgal and Marguerite Maida. By looking at how their neural pathways were hardwired before the crash, we can see a textbook collision between normalcy bias and ambiguity tolerance.
Because their brains were trained in completely different arenas. We don't need to rehash their entire biographies, but the psychological contrast is what matters.
It's the key to everything that happens next.
Paul Torgal's entire neural architecture was forged in corporate boardrooms. He was the head of a massive corporation. His brain was conditioned over decades to expect immediate obedience, controlled variables, and absolute dominance over his surroundings.
Very structured.
Right. Margaret's brain, on the other hand, was forged in the chaos of war as a mercenary. Her baseline for normal was a violently shifting, unpredictable combat zone.
And that conditioning dictates their immediate survival strategy. When the Degassi initially crashed, the survivors managed to reach the floating island. Paul immediately declared they were staying there.
Because it's land.
Yes. To his prefrontal cortex, the concept of land equated to safety, tradition, and a recognizable terrestrial hierarchy. It was a categorical imperative. Land is safe, the ocean is dangerous.
Which makes sense on paper.
It does. But Marguerite looked at the exact same patch of land and correctly identified it as a terminal threat. She saw the violent, unpredictable storms, the flooded agricultural grow beds, and the complete lack of sustainable calories.
She saw the reality of it.
Yeah, she demanded they move beneath the surface, first descending into the jelly shrimp caves and eventually plunging into the deep Grand Reef.
So Paul is desperately clinging to this tiny rock because it feels like Earth, while Marguerite is trying to force them into the dark, crushing depths of an alien ocean because the math says they will starve on the surface.
Precisely. Paul's reaction is a profound manifestation of normalcy bias. The investigative journalist Amanda Ripley outlines this brilliantly in her research on disaster psychology.
Oh, I've read her stuff. It's fascinating.
Right. When humans are confronted with a sudden, catastrophic disruption to their reality, they do not immediately spring into heroic action. Ripley identified 3 distinct phases of disaster response: denial, deliberation, and the decisive moment.
Okay, bring those down for us.
In the denial phase, the brain literally cannot process the sheer scale of the threat because it violates every established schema the person holds. The amygdala registers the danger, but the prefrontal cortex essentially blocks the signal, trying to force the terrifying new reality to fit into a familiar, safe pattern.
I think about this all the time. Ripley talks about the sinking of the MV Estonia in the Baltic Sea. The ship was taking on massive amounts of water and listing violently.
Yeah.
But instead of scrambling for the lifeboats, witnesses reported that dozens of people in the cafeteria simply sat at their tables. They held onto their plates so they wouldn't slide off. The ship was actively going down, and their brains were stuck in a loop of, I'm in a cafeteria, therefore I must sit and eat.
It's tragic, but it's how the brain works. We see the exact same neurological freeze in aviation disasters, like the Tenerife airport collision. Passengers survived the initial impact but burned to death in their seats because they sat quietly, waiting for the seatbelt sign to turn off and for a flight attendant to give them instructions.
They were just waiting for normal rules to apply.
Exactly. They were paralyzed in the deliberation phase, waiting for a normal authority figure to validate the abnormal situation. Paul Torgall is cognitively paralyzed on the floating island. He is trapped in denial and deliberation.
Waiting for a rescue ship that is never coming.
Marguerite, conversely, lives perpetually in Ripley's 3rd phase, decisive action. Her brain instantly processes the novelty of the threat, bypasses the denial phase entirely, and begins formulating actionable steps.
And that leads right into the concept of ambiguity tolerance.
Exactly. The psychological framework of ambiguity tolerance was pioneered by Else Frankel-Brunswick in 1949 during her post-WWII studies on authoritarian personalities, and later codified by Stanley Budner in 1962.
Okay, so what did Budner find?
Budner defined ambiguity and tolerance as the tendency to perceive ambiguous situations as sources of threat. He identified 3 specific triggers: novelty, complexity, and insolubility.
And 4546B basically maxes out all 3 of those triggers simultaneously.
Oh, 100%. Paul Torgall possesses extreme ambiguity and tolerance. His corporate background requires black and white data. When confronted with an ocean that defies his understanding, his ego feels actively threatened.
Which he just shuts down.
He rigidly adheres to simplistic categorization to artificially lower his anxiety. Land equals good, water equals bad.
It's cognitive inflexibility. He can't update his software to match the new hardware of the planet. But Marguerite has an incredibly high ambiguity tolerance. She doesn't take the weirdness of the planet personally. She just views it as a new set of physics to master.
Right. She evaluates the ambiguity not as a threat to her identity, but as a neutral puzzle. People with high ambiguity tolerance possess a flexible disposition. They do not require immediate certainty to function.
That's a huge advantage.
Huge! They can operate effectively in the gray areas, holding conflicting pieces of information like the fact that the ocean is terrifying, but also their only source of food, without suffering cognitive paralysis.
But, I want to push back on this a little bit.
Sure, go ahead.
Is Marguerite's aggressive push to live inside a cramped, dark, underwater cave system actually a sign of pragmatic ambiguity tolerance? Or are we just looking at a deeply traumatized, dishonorably discharged mercenary who is unconsciously recreating the only environment she understands?
That's a fair question.
Like, is she adapting to the ocean, or is she just turning the ocean into a war zone because she doesn't know how to exist in peacetime?
That is the pivotal question of her character arc. Are her actions driven by rational adaptation or unhealed trauma? To answer that, we have to analyze the tipping point that destroyed the Degassi crew entirely The Reaper incident.
Right, so the situation has escalated. They are living deep underwater in the Grand Reef. Bart Tortle, Paul's son, is brilliant and adaptable in his own way. He discovers that they are all infected with the Kara bacterium.
Yeah, a totally different kind of threat.
And Bart's psychological response is to study it. He wants to build a laboratory, isolate the pathogen, and fight a microscopic scientific war.
But Marguerite's neural pathways are not built for microscopic patients. She cannot fight something she cannot see. The ambiguity of a slow, internal biological death is intolerable to her.
So she has to make it physical.
Yes. She decides to externalize the threat. As the logs state, she decides to go looking for a fight. She leaves the relative safety of the deep reef, actively hunts down a Reaper Leviathan, violently wounds it, and drags its thrashing body back to their underwater habitat to provide a live specimen for Bart.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
We already established that the entire architecture of this world is designed to make you hide. The game strips away your weapons to force a narrative of coexistence and submission to nature.
Exactly.
Marguerite forcefully, violently rejects that entire premise.
She does. And from a psychological standpoint, dragging that apex predator back to the base is a breathtakingly extreme form of cognitive restructuring. The amygdala's natural response to a Reaper Leviathan is flight.
Obviously.
But Marguerite is trapped on a planet that is methodically, quietly killing her from the inside out with Kara.
Yeah.
She is experiencing a total loss of agency. By intentionally capturing the most terrifying monster on the planet, she is forcing her brain to rewrite the synaptic weighting of the threat.
It's like exposure therapy inverted. Instead of a therapist slowly introducing a picture of a spider to an arachnophobe in a safe room to slowly lower their heart rate, Marguerite intentionally triggers the absolute worst-case scenario on her own terms.
Yeah.
She is the one holding the leash. She is hacking her own fear response by forcing the ultimate symbol of terror to become her prey.
It is a radical reclamation of agency. But, nature does not care about human cognitive restructuring.
Yeah.
The consequences are catastrophic.
Yeah, it doesn't end well.
A second Reaper Leviathan, likely tracking the blood trail or the acoustic distress signals of the captive, descends upon the Degassi base. The habitat is compromised and crushed.
And this is where the divergence in their psychologies reaches its fatal conclusion. In the chaos of the base collapsing, Paul Tortle flees into the dark water. And what does he do? He sees a mesmerizing glowing light in the distance, and he swims toward it. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Paul's death is the ultimate tragic failure of his normalcy bias. In a moment of absolute panic and sensory overload, his brain desperately searches for anything familiar, anything comforting.
The light looks like safety.
Exactly. The glowing light, like the bioluminescence of a mesmer or a crab squid, represents the artificial lights of his corporate world. It represents safety. His brain overrides the rational observation that in the deep ocean, glowing lights are almost always predatory lures.
He just couldn't override his conditioning.
No. He swims toward the comfort of the familiar, and it leads him directly into the jaws of a predator. He dies because he could not overwrite his terrestrial hardwiring.
While Paul is following the pretty lights, Marguerite is moving in the exact opposite direction.
Yeah.
She doesn't run. She engages the attacking Reaper in close quarters, hand-to-hand combat with nothing but a piece of scrap metal.
Which initiates the most extreme survival scenario documented in the lore. The Reaper ensnares her and drags her down, plunging her 500 meters below the surface, right off the edge of the volcanic crater.
She is dragged into the void. The ecological dead zone.
Yeah.
The area of the map that is literally designed to be a developer boundary where the water turns black and multiple ghost leviathans spawn just to terrify the player into turning around. And she has exactly 4 minutes of oxygen remaining in her tank.
In that impossibly brief, chaotic window, while being thrashed in the pitch black of the abyss, Marguerite manages to drive a jagged metal shard deep into the Reaper's neck, severing something vital, and she kills it.
She breaks the surface.
Yeah.
But she isn't in the Seychelles. She is floating in the void. There is no landmass in sight. The Degassi base is gone. Her crew is gone. She is entirely isolated in an endless ocean.
It's completely hopeless.
And what she does next defies belief. She climbs on top of the rotting, buoyant carcass of the Reaper she just killed, and she uses it as a raft.
It's just wild.
She drifts on this decaying monster for weeks. To survive the dropping temperatures as the currents pull her toward Sector Zero, she harvests the Leviathan's blubber and burns its fat for warmth. She uses that fire to boil seawater for drinking.
To understand how a human mind does not simply give up and drown in that scenario, we have to look closely at the work of Lawrence Gonzalez.
Right.
In his seminal book, Deep Survival, Who Lives, Who Dies, and Why, Gonzalez spent decades analyzing the neurobiology of survival in extreme, hopeless situations. His core finding completely upends how most people think about survival.
Which is that it's all about the gear, right?
Exactly, but it's not. It is almost never about the equipment you have or even your level of physical training. Survival is governed almost entirely by personality, emotional regulation, and cognitive attitude.
Right. Gonzalez argues that you can have all the elite gear in the world, but if you lack the specific emotional framework to process absolute despair, you will just die with a lot of expensive equipment in your pockets.
Gonzalez points out that true survivors engage in what is heavily related to the Stockdale paradox.
Named after Admiral James Stockdale, right?
Yes, who survived over 7 years in a Vietnam prisoner of war camp. The paradox is this: you must retain absolute, unwavering faith that you will prevail in the end, regardless of the difficulties. Andy, at the same time, you must confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be.
The optimists die because their hearts break when they aren't rescued by Christmas. The pessimists die because they give up immediately. The survivor holds both extremes in their mind at once.
Precisely how Marguerit operated on that carcass. She confronted the brutal, grotesque reality of her situation. She was sitting on a rotting piece of meat in the middle of a dead ocean.
Yeah, no delusions there.
She didn't waste cognitive energy wishing she was back on the floating island. She accepted the horror of her environment and broke her survival down into hyper-focused, immediate tasks. Gonzalez calls this taking it baby step by baby step.
So whatever needs to be done right now.
Exactly. If the baby step required for the next hour of survival meant plunging her hands into alien viscera to extract combustible fat so she wouldn't freeze to death in the dark, she executed that task without hesitation or self-pity.
But I have to bring us back to the sheer darkness of that image. The game explicitly uses the void as a psychological weapon against the player. It is meant to evoke such primal dread that you turn your submarine around immediately.
Yeah, it's designed to scare you away.
Marguerite didn't just survive the void. She turned the very monster guarding the deep into her personal lifeboat. Is this just an example of unparalleled biological grit? Or has her brain completely detached from normal human fear responses? Has she lost her humanity to survive?
I would argue she hasn't lost her humanity. She has fundamentally restructured it through a process known as post-traumatic growth. To understand the difference, we have to look at how her story continues and contrast her ultimate fate with the failure of the hyper-advanced architects.
Because her story doesn't end drifting in the ice. Fast forward years later to the events of Below Zero. The protagonist, Robin Ayu, is exploring the freezing biomes of Sector Zero, and she discovers that Margaret is not only alive, she is thriving.
Yeah, she built an entire life there.
She has constructed a massive, highly functional base out of the giant skeletal remains of Leviathans. She is cultivating local flora like Preston's plant. She has tamed a snowstalker. And she is actively working to sabotage the mega-corporation Altera because she still harbors this intense burning hatred for trans-system governments. She isn't cowering in a cave, she owns the territory.
Thriving is the exact clinical term here. In the mid-90s, psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun identified a phenomenon that went beyond simple recovery from trauma. They coined the term post-traumatic growth, or PTG.
How is that different from resilience?
It's vital to differentiate the two. Resilience is essentially psychological elasticity. A resilient person experiences a severe stressor, their life is disrupted, but eventually they bounce back to their previous baseline of functioning. They return to the person they were before the crash.
They survive, but they don't necessarily transform.
Right, but PTG is a complete neurological and psychological metamorphosis. It occurs when a trauma is so severe that it completely shatters a person's assumptive worldview, the core beliefs they hold about how safe, predictable, and fair the universe is.
They can't go back.
Exactly. When those schemas are destroyed, the brain cannot go back to the baseline. It must build entirely new schemas from the rubble. Tedeschi and Calhoun found that individuals who achieve PTG often report profound growth in several specific domains: a heightened sense of personal strength, the discovery of new possibilities, a deeper appreciation for life, and a fundamental shift in how they relate to the world around them.
So Marguerite didn't just bounce back to being the exact same mercenary she was on the Degassi. She integrated the horror of 4546B into her new identity. The trauma literally became the foundation of her new life.
Absolutely.
I mean, building her living room out of the rib cages of the Leviathans that tried to consume her. I cannot think of a more literal, visceral metaphor for post-traumatic growth. She took the architecture of her trauma and turned it into her shelter.
It is the ultimate expression of cognitive accommodation. In psychology, assimilation is when you try to force new information. What Turgal tried to do on the island. Accommodation is when you change your beliefs to fit the new information.
That makes total sense.
Marguerite allowed the trauma to rewrite her operational schemas, making her perfectly adapted to the hostility of the planet. And to truly appreciate the magnitude of her human adaptability, we must contrast her with the architects.
The ancient alien race. They were hyper-advanced, technologically superior in every conceivable way, operating as a collective consciousness. And they suffered their own version of a crisis. A pandemic of the Carabacterium swept through their networks, killing over 143 billion of their people across their core worlds.
Faced with a catastrophe on a galactic scale, how did the architects respond? With absolute, unyielding ambiguity and tolerance.
So they were like Paul Torgal.
Exactly. They approached biology the way Paul Torgal approached a corporate merger. They attempted to strictly command and control nature through rigid data and force. They built facilities on 4546b to find a cure.
Right.
They captured the sea emperor Leviathan because she produced enzyme 42, which cured the bacterium. But when they realized she was too old to produce a potent version of the enzyme, they couldn't adapt to the biological reality of the situation.
They tried to force the process. They subjected her eggs to massive hormonal interventions. They forcefully dissected the eggs.
Yeah, just brutal, rigid control.
And when that aggressive approach failed, they doubled down on their need for control. They abducted an egg from a completely different species, the sea dragon Leviathan, to study hatching conditions in a controlled laboratory.
They completely underestimated the chaotic, irrational biological rage of a parent whose offspring has been stolen. They assumed nature would passively submit to their data models,
which resulted in the mother sea dragon tracking her egg to the disease research facility, ramming the structure with such immense kinetic force that the facility collapsed, the sea dragon died of head trauma, and the Carabacterium was released into the ecosystem, ravaging the entire planet.
The architects failed because they relied entirely on rigid logic and systemic control. When their inflexible data models failed to contain the chaotic reality of nature, they didn't adapt.
They didn't have that post-traumatic growth.
No, they didn't exhibit post-traumatic growth at all. They retreated, they digitized their consciousnesses, downloaded themselves into sanctuary cubes, and effectively hid in the dark, hoping to wait out the storm.
Wow.
They failed because they could not tolerate the unpredictable, violent ambiguity of life. Marguerite survived because she was willing to embrace the chaos. She was willing to become as brutal, as violent, and as adaptable as the ecosystem itself.
She is the one chaotic variable that the cold, calculating architects and decades later, the corporate bean counters at Alterra could never account for. Pure, unyielding, irrational human will. She didn't try to build a sterile laboratory to study the planet. She put on a prawn suit, grabbed a reaper by the throat, and told the planet to adapt to her.
This raises an important question, however. Has Marguerite actually found peace at the end of her journey? Or has her post-traumatic growth simply made her perfectly adapted to an environment that constantly mirrors her own internal, unresolved war?
That's a great point.
She is still holding bitter grudges against trans-system governments. She lives in extreme isolation. She surrounds herself with the bones of her enemies. We must ask, is she truly at peace with her survival? Or is she merely the apex predator of her own trauma, forever locked in a fight response?
That is a remarkably heavy thought, and it forces you to look inward. For you, the listener, navigating the complexities of your own life, how do you handle the reapers that emerge from the dark?
Yeah, what's your default response?
When a sudden massive disruption shatters your normalcy bias, what is your default neural pathway? Do you retreat inward, hiding in the digital sanctuaries of your mind like the architects, waiting for the danger to pass while your world collapses around you? Or do you figure out a way, no matter how brutal, exhausting, or messy, to climb onto the back of the beast and ride it out of the storm?
It is the defining question of survival psychology. When confronted with the crushing ambiguity of the unknown, do we let the environment dictate our demise, or do we exert our will to force a new reality into existence?
So what does this all mean? If we look back at the incredible psychological journey we've mapped out today, We started by exploring how the engineered, sensory-depriving terror of 4546b strips away our environmental anchors and systematically shatters the human normalcy bias.
Yeah, the planet itself breaks you down.
We saw how the neurological mechanics of ambiguity tolerance became the fatal dividing line between Paul Torgall's tragic inability to adapt and Marguerite Maida's aggressive reclamation of agency.
It's just a stark contrast.
And we unpacked how extreme, unimaginable trauma can serve as the catalyst for post-traumatic growth, completely rewriting the cognitive schemas of a stranded, dishonorably discharged mercenary and transforming her into the undisputed apex predator of an alien ocean.
And yet, as we conclude, there is a lingering thought we must consider. We have spent this entire time analyzing the violent triumph of Marguerite's will, but we must remember the other side of the Degassi coin.
What was that?
We must consider young Bart Torgall. Before he finally succumbed to the Cara bacterium alone, looking out over the ocean from the floating island, he recorded a final audio log.
Oh, that log breaks my heart.
He didn't die raging against the dying of the light. He realized that his destiny was not to conquer 4546b. It wasn't to cure the disease with data or bend the Leviathans to his will with violence. He found a profound, quiet acceptance that his role was simply to become a part of the planet's ecosystem, to return his biology to the water.
Wow.
So the question I leave you with to mull over is this. Which response actually requires more true psychological strength? The relentless, mercenary will to fight the crushing depths of the ocean until your dying breath, or the profound, terrifying peace required to simply let the tide take you?
That's a beautiful way to put it. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It has been an incredible, exhausting journey through the darkest depths of the human mind and the most unforgiving trenches of 4546b. We warmly invite you to return next time as we continue to explore the fascinating psychological landscapes hidden within the worlds we love. Stay curious, watch your peripheral vision, and we will see you in the deep.